Please welcome to the stage Emily Greaves.
Thank you, Amit. That was really wonderful. For those of you that haven't met me, my name is Emily. I am the Patient Engagement Manager here at the Children's Tumor Foundation. I've been running around. One of the things that I do is help the organizers put on this wonderful event. The other is that I manage our patient engagement program here at CTF called CTF Engage. We are going to be switching gears for the rest of the morning, and I want to talk a little bit about why. I hope my session makes those things a little bit clear. Patient engagement is something that is really important to us as a foundation, and you'll hear later today why patient engagement is so important from different perspectives, from physicians' perspectives, from the pharma perspective. But the purpose of my talk today is to talk about patient engagement from the patient communities that have really pioneered this movement. In the recent history, there's been some patient groups that have made a lot of progress and changes in their research ecosystems through patient engagement. And I want to talk a little bit about that, why it's important for us here at CTF, why we care about patient engagement, and then a little bit about CTF Engage. At the end, you'll get to hear from one of our advocates about his journey through research engagement. So thank you, and we'll get started. So I like to start off talking about patient engagement with a little thought experiment, so if you guys will bear with me. If we think about a patient that goes to their doctor, looks like here, like this person has a toothache. It could be, a sickness, it could be an illness, it could be a disease they might have, for their entire life, a genetic condition like NF. This patient goes to their doctor and they, discuss possible treatments, discuss what's bothering them. As you guys know, there are many times when we get to the clinic and there's just not much we can do, things aren't working. And this patient, might ask their doctor, well, what else is out there? Who's working on this? And what can I expect to come in the future for my disease and people like me? So the answer to that is obviously scientists and researchers. There's just one here, but as we know, there are many, many people that are working really hard in many different types of diseases. And the way that we study diseases, as you guys know, is by taking data from our patient community. So it could be cells, it could be a tumor sample, it could be a survey. For those of you that are in the NF registry, you might be a little familiar with surveys. And that's how we collect things from patients so we understand what's going on with this disease, what are ways that we can treat it, and how do we develop those treatments further. Eventually, a pharmaceutical company will get involved. Pharma companies take things that are promising and make them actionable and scalable on a scale that we can bring them to patients. They help usher treatments through the development process. You'll hear more about that in the next session. They work with the US Food and Drug Administration to get these drugs approved. In other words, what is safe and effective for this disease. And then at the very end, after decades and a lot of money and a lot of people, we have hopefully treatments. I put medicines here like drugs. This could be a gene therapy. It could be a device. It could be a clinical innovation. But we talk about the drugs here at the end, and this is just all to say that after this long kind of snaking process, the drugs that we have in the end are only as good as the input that we have throughout the way. And when we think about patient engagement, it's helpful to think about how research is traditionally done, which is this method, and it's important to consider that there's really only two inputs for how the patient gets a say in what that drug is going to be at the end, how it's going to help, what it's going to look like. And the first is in participating in research, donating that data, filling out that survey, talking with researchers. The second is at the end about whether they decide to use that treatment or not. And you think about, consumer economics, it's the same as, which cereal you buy at the store. Is this drug something that would make sense for me? Is the side effect something that I can tolerate? Those are really the only two endpoints to these systems. And patient engagement is the process of adding more and more arrows into this process so that that drug that we get at the very end is the very best possible version that we can get there, that it meets the needs of that particular patient, other patients like them, and the community. So I just want to talk a little bit about some cases from history, recent history, that have really brought this to the forefront. And the patient community that really gets the most credit for bringing patient engagement is something that we still see, I think, reverberating through what we have in our system today. They made a lot of changes as a result of their activism, and that is the HIV/AIDS patient community, particularly in the 80s. So if you think about by the year 1988 is when around these photos were taken. By 1988, there were a lot of scientists that are working for about 8 years now on finding effective treatments and therapies for the virus HIV and the disease that causes AIDS. But there was really little to show for it. And in modern medicine in the US, the virus was progressing so quickly within patients and from patient to patient that it was really unprecedented in terms of the research community. Something that I think is relevant to us being here in Texas is that demonstrates also the importance of how really patients were so desperate for treatments is this man here, Ron Woodruff. You might know him not by his photographed here by the Dallas Morning News, but by the movie Dallas Buyers Club. He was played by Matthew McConaughey. Ron Woodruff and others like him organized these buyers clubs where patients would pool their resources together. Ron would travel to Mexico, he'd travel to Europe, he would get drugs that were experimental, not yet approved for use in the US, bring them back so patients could try them on their own. He actually got in a bit of trouble for this, you can imagine why. But others like him did things like this, and we'll see from the patient community's complaints about what was going on at the time, why that is. This photo here is from a protest at the FDA in '88 by an organization called ACT UP. They were based out of New York, and they were known for these really loud, in-your-face protests, both at the NIH and the FDA, in very public places in New York, Chicago, and DC. I like this photo, and you can kind of read some of these signs they have here about what their main concerns were. You see the word placebo over here. You see lack of, but this was an experimental treatment at the time, complaints about the FDA, about pharma profits. And these really reflect some of the main complaints that these groups had. Chiefly, the idea was that institutions, the way that we typically have done research at this time was just too slow compared to how fastly this virus was progressing and how much people were suffering. Funding was also inadequate, so there were holdups at the NIH and the FDA. Placebos were a problem at the time. You think about traditional trial designs, we need placebos to both control for the placebo effect and know that the drug that we're studying, is effective comparison to something else. But the FDA and other people at the time were really concerned with, crossing the T's and dotting their I's when it came to placebos. And if it meant, doing nothing, were meant a death sentence for many people, then you can imagine why the idea of joining a clinical trial, something that you desperately wanted, that you would have a chance of getting something that meant nothing. And that would really discourage participation in these trials. The other thing is that a misconception at the time that I think is important to talk about here is that this virus was thought to affect mostly young men in urban areas, but that's actually not true. And even the studies at the time, for either reasons for this misconception or just the feasibility of studying these populations, meant that women and children were often excluded from trials, and that effectively denied them treatment from experimental, potentially life-saving experiments. And so you can see why, under all these things, people were, interested in doing these things like buyers clubs. So they were very successful on a couple of these big protests, and there's some great stories from an oral history project that I encourage you guys to look at. This is like a pet interest of mine. There's a great one from the NIH protest that they did. Then NIAID director, Dr. Anthony Fauci, was at the NIH when these patient groups stormed. Security met them, tried to prevent them from getting in the building. He recognized a few activists that he had personal relationships with and invited them into the building to talk. So results from this movement, couple things. The first is the parallel track. The idea that if you didn't qualify for a clinical trial, for example, if you were on a study previously, another drug that might affect how we study that drug, that new drug, if you did not meet the inclusion criteria for any number of reasons, that you couldn't access that. The parallel track opened up abilities so where you could join the study and join the protocol. The integrity of the data that you're looking at, what's going to move the science forward is still there, but that people could still access those treatments. The other one talks about placebos. This is the use of historical controls. The idea that, balancing both the need to have a very rigorous scientific study with something that really balances the patient priority, for getting access to these drugs. So historical controls meant that, we could use smaller placebo groups, more folks that joined studies would actually get the treatment. This is what we talk about. We talk about natural history studies being important. We can compare the cohort of the trial to how we know that the disease normally develops. And this also, as you can imagine, meant more people were interested in participating in these trials. And then a formality, but something that is really important, is the first patient representative sat on an advisory council at the FDA. It was an AIDS patient, and that was in '93. Let's see. So bringing into the 90s, the next patient community I think really did some cool things with this is the breast cancer community. And I really love talking about this woman here, Dr. Susan Love. She passed away last year, but she was a really pioneering surgeon out of Boston. She talks about, in some of her writings, about her career being the first female surgeon on her floor at her hospital in Boston. And she was a general surgeon by training, but by virtue of that being the first female surgeon on that floor, she got a lot of breast cancer patients referred to her, and really just kind of fell into this community, built a lot of long-lasting relationships with them. What she's really known for is leading the movement away from what we call the radical mastectomies, removing the entire breast completely towards the more targeted lumpectomies. And I like this quote here, wanting to keep your breast is not about vanity, but it's about being intact as a person. And I think that really perfectly encapsulates what we talk about when we talk about patient engagement. It's the people that are in charge of recommending the best treatments and keeping us safe and healthy, but it's also balancing the patient community priorities. That's only something you can get from these kinds of long relationships with the patient community. So she, as well as being a surgeon and a physician, co-founded the National Breast Cancer Coalition with some prominent patients. And one of those patients had some really interesting experiences with her breast cancer diagnosis. She said she would go to the clinic and she would have concerns about what else is out there? What should I be thinking about in terms of, research coming down the pipeline? And she was kind of continually told, don't worry about it. You just focus on getting better. We'll take care of you. She said she would go to these breast cancer support groups, and a lot of the topics were about, what's the best shade of lipstick to wear and how to style your wig, which is important. But really recognized with her peers this hunger for learning more about science, learning more about research, and learning more about the federal kind of funding ecosystem that drives all of these things forward. And says 91, it's actually 96, the National Breast Cancer Coalition established a crash course for ladies that wanted to learn more about breast cancer called Project LEAD. They studied molecular biology, genetics. They learned how drugs get through the ecosystem and how the different phases of clinical development. Some things that we talk about in our program, CTF Engage, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So bringing into the 2000s, it's interesting because those first two groups get a lot of the credit for the genesis of patient engagement, and I think rightfully so. Where I think personally that patient engagement has really found its niche and has really flourished is with the rare diseases, and you can imagine why, because there's some particular challenges when it comes to rare diseases. As you guys know, NF is a rare disease, and this is kind of where we have been working really hard. Some of the challenges with NF is with other rare diseases, rare cancers, those kinds of things are different than what you think of for breast cancer. So typically, rare diseases are less understood. That could be there's less research, there's less folks to participate. Sometimes it just means that, like with NF, there's a high variability between case to case, and we don't really understand why. Fewer patients, of course, means fewer participants in clinical trials. It means that those trials that do get funded may not get totally enrolled, data may not be published, and then there's a lot of knowledge loss there, of course. And that, of course, with a lot of high-need communities, clinical trials are often the only way to get access to good treatments, or treatments at all. Talk about this first. This chart here is a little bit blurry, but this is mapping the evolution of patient engagement at the FDA. It's not exactly linear, so if you see this first dot here are the 1980s, the second dot is the entire 1990s, and then the rest of this is the last 20 years. Each little kind of gray box with some bullet points is places where the FDA has opened up for patient involvement in the way that they approve and look at drugs. I'll note that this talks about the FDA, and we'll hear more about this later, but pharma too was really, I think, projected quite nicely onto this in terms of ways that they're looking to get engaged with the patient voice. So we have a lot of things exciting in the rare diseases in recent times. I like to show this cartoon because it talks about something that also was working at this time to help the rare diseases, which is called the Orphan Drug Act in '83. This cartoon basically shows what the drug did, what the act did was to orphan diseases or diseases where somebody might not want to invest because it might not be as profitable, made it a little bit more equal playing field in terms of incentivizing investment in these areas. And you can see the guys in blue here are different rare diseases: ALS, Huntington's, muscular dystrophy. The red, of course, are the different government agencies that are trying to work together. And little orphan Annie has made a way to touchdown at the FDA approval. This really paved the way for rare diseases in general and investment. And then, of course, the 21st Century Cures Act, much more recently, advanced that and also cemented into law a lot of what we have known for the past couple decades, that patient engagement needs to be an integral part of this. So I'll kind of stop there. That's a bit of the history. So we've seen in practice how patient engagement works. I just wanted to pause here and talk about the term patient engagement because I actually kind of hate it. It's, I think, a very vague, what does it mean to engage a patient? You can engage a patient many ways. But when we at the foundation talk about patient engagement, and for the purpose of today, patient engagement is the meaningful interaction of patients and their families in the research process. And I say meaningful, and I don't just mean, participating in studies, although that is meaningful, of course, and we want communities to get more involved in them. But it's also making those studies better and working at a high level, working with researchers to make sure that the quality of research that we're doing is something that's in line with patient priorities. And we'll talk a little bit about some examples of that in a minute. I like this graph too, just pick this graphic too, because there are lots of cogs in the system, but patients and their families ideally should be the ones driving all of these things working together. So in 2018, if you guys were here with us at the Atlanta Forum, Children's Tumor Foundation launched the Patient Representative Training Program. And what this did, it set out a couple things. First of which, very similar to Project LEAD, the Breast Cancer Coalition, was to train patients on research topics, get them a little bit more, for those that are interested, of course, a little bit more knowledgeable about the science, about the research, how we conduct research in this country, and what are the ways in which we can get involved. The second goal was to create this culture of patient centricity at CTF and with those we work with. And this graph, I think, just really nicely shows that in 2018, we held our first training session. We trained 25 patient advocates. And then over the course of the next couple years, up until COVID, we really proliferated the amount of projects and the amount of patients that we were bringing into those projects when it comes to patient engagement. So I came to the foundation in 2022, and after COVID and with the strategic plan, we really wanted to reevaluate how we were doing patient engagement, what can we do more. So that's when we established CTF Engage. It has the same goals as the original with 2 more involved. So we're still training patients, we're still pushing for those patient centricity to be a real tenet of the research process within NF research. We talk about adding a couple things here to our goals. First of which is to cultivate and support engagement projects. And so something that it's not just enough to train you guys and empower you guys and send you out to go do research engagement, but really working with scientists that are doing research and demanding that chairs be pulled up to the table. That's what that's talking about. The third tenet speaks to the real, I call this like the ambassadorial potential of patient representatives. And I like this graphic because it shows the different groups we have here. You have scientists on the one end, and then the broader NF community on the other. We work really hard at events like this to make sure that scientists and the community have a chance to interact, talk to one another, talk about science. But we know that's hard. It's really hard to talk about not just one clinical trial, but a lot of clinical trials, or a lot of inciting research, within a 15-minute talk or even a whole weekend. So just to acknowledge that it is difficult to sometimes have this communication, and patient representatives, when they're working with scientists, are of course representing themselves, but they're also representing the needs of the community, and that's something we talk a lot about in our program is, what is your value of being a patient at the table, and then what additional value can you bring by being in community with other patients and, learning from one another. And then the flip side of that is this other part that research is often hard to understand, and, we all have a hard time, taking care of ourselves and with all the barriers that come into that, and that patient representatives, as folks that are more interested in this, that might have a little bit more of a training or a background, that might have worked on a study or two, can then go back to the community, say, this is the high level of what you need to know. If you've ever gone to PubMed and tried to read an abstract from a study you were interested in, it's hard. And so writing lay summaries, for example, of those studies, making them a little bit more accessible and explaining them in a way that is helpful for the community. So that speaks to a little bit about what patient reps can do to mediate between these two groups. I want to talk briefly about what we do and what we do not do at CTF Engage. One of the wonderful things about this foundation is there are so many different ways to get involved, and we all are, are going towards the goal of ending NF. But everyone has different skill sets and interests. And what we do is research engagement, of course. What we don't do is, fundraising. It's not advocating to Congress or your politicians. And of course, like I said, it's not participating in research oneself, although that's important. That's, a decision you have to make with your team and your family. What we do here is at that higher level, making sure that the quality of research that we do is really there. So this is just some example of some projects that folks in our program will be doing. First of all is priority setting. It's, can be as easy as talking to a researcher. This is what's important to me. This is what I think you should study. This is what matters to the community and, my conversations. It could be reviewing materials for a specific study, whether that's a protocol, recruitment materials. Could be partnering with a researcher and advising a study long-term. My background before this is I did community-based research in public health, and we worked with the older adult population. And so I belonged to a research team. We would have Zoom calls. We would talk about how we were progressing with the study. We had a community advisory board that we met with regularly with members of the community that we were studying. And we would go to them and say, regularly and say, oh, we're having a problem recruiting this demographic. We went to these areas and we posted on these sites, what might be a problem, a solution there that we can, brainstorm. Or we have some preliminary data, looks really interesting, take a look at it. What jumps out to you? What do you think are the questions we should be asking ourselves? I think this long-term partnership is something that is really important here. It's always important to have a conversation with the researcher, as much exposure and interaction you can get, but if we can get these long-term relationships to really build and flourish over a researcher's career, from project to project. I think that's really the sweet spot there. And then, like I said at the end, disseminating results, really kind of being that go-between and saying, this is something that I think the community would want to hear about. Let's go talk about it in this way, and answering questions, talking about what it means to participate in a trial, what it means to participate in a registry, for example, all these things. All right, so far, we launched an application for CTF Engage in October of this year, had a month-long application window, closed that in November, and we welcomed 34 new advocates to our program. Have a training program. It's like a 5-hour online-based training. I designed it. I think it's pretty good, but it's got podcasts and videos. It's not meant to be an end-all, be-all of this is everything you need to know about research, it's everything you need to know about genetics or molecular biology. More so getting you accustomed to asking the right types of questions when you're in these conversations, and the confidence, I think, to talk to a researcher and really challenge them. Say, this is what I think. What do you think? And then, of course, in February, began matching them to these projects. So since then, we've started and or completed 8 projects so far. 4 of those were initiated by different departments of the Children's Tumor Foundation. Many of those are still going on, and 3 of those with companies, 1 with an academic institution. And we're always looking for more. So if you are interested in getting involved with our patients, please come talk to me after and we can talk about it. So I want to stop here, and in a second I'm going to invite one of our advocates to come join me on the stage, and we'll have a little discussion about what it means to participate in research. But I just want to say that we have a little bit of an announcement, and this is always, I think, kind of fun to do. We've talked about this, but never kind of such a big audience before. So for those of you that were here in 2019, you might have known we did a patient listening study with a patient listening session with the FDA. The idea is that the US FDA, of course, is a group that helps decide if drugs are safe and effective. And they talk to researchers all the time. They talk to clinicians and doctors. They get a sense of what the data says, but they created these sessions as a forum for input from the patient community. And excited to announce that this May, we will be doing another patient listening session with specifically patients with NF1 to talk about cutaneous neurofibromas. This is photos from the 2019 session. It was broadly about all types of NF. We got a really awesome chance to talk for folks to talk about their experiences, to share with members of the FDA what it's like to live with NF, so that when they are looking at a new drug application or when they're looking at an approval, they have a little bit of context about, for example, if there's a 20% shrinkage in tumor volume, well, what does that mean for a patient? How would that be helpful? So we're really excited for this session. Can't say too much about it yet because it has not happened yet, but we'll have a full report that'll come out in June talking about all the things that were said, all the feedback we got, and we're excited specifically to talk about cutaneous neurofibromas because, as I'm sure it's not a stranger to anybody in this room, but CNFs are often misunderstood, even in the research community, as something that's cosmetic, not very important compared to the other things that we should be researching. Why are we looking at these? We know that's not true, and that cutaneous neurofibromas, of course, really impact patients' quality of life. And that we know that they are a priority for the community, and there's been some really interesting data the last few years that have really backed that up. So I'll stop there. I have some sources if you want to look into any of the history stuff I talked about in the beginning, and my contact information. And then now we're going to transition a little bit. I'm going to have Michael Peper come and join me on the stage, who's one of our advocates on CTF Engage. Thanks so much. Got you mic'd up?
Sorry.
They got you mic'd?
Yeah.
All right.
Well, it's this one.
All right. So Michael, thank you for joining. Michael is one of our advocates that joined in November, and I just wanted to give you an opportunity first to introduce yourself, everybody, tell a little bit about who you are and maybe a bit about your NF story.
Sure. Thanks, Emily. My name is Michael Peper. I live in Lawrence, Kansas. Both my wife Tandy, and our oldest son Henry do not have NF, but our youngest son, who would, if he were here, he would say, "Hi, my name is Leo. I'm 5.5. My birthday is in 6 days." He was diagnosed with NF1 before his first birthday, and we discovered when he was 2 that he had a growing tumor in his brain, and so he underwent chemo treatment for about a year, which was fantastically successful. They cannot pick it up on scans anymore. We're down to annual scans. If you're familiar with this is all good news. That's our story. He's in kindergarten this year. Thank you. He's in kindergarten this year and doing great. And actually, just by chance, his kindergarten teacher also has NF1, which was just an amazing thing and just happened by accident. So he's got like a built-in advocate for him in the school setting, which is amazing.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I know you have, there's a reason why I brought you up on stage today is because you've been involved in some research, and I wanted to, parallel to that, what is your NF research story?
Yeah, thanks. So I'm an academic librarian working in universities, and one of the things I do is that I support systematic review projects and partner on research teams in that aspect. And systematic reviews, if you're not familiar, are a method for studying where you combine multiple primary studies to answer a specific research question, and you combine all the data from those studies to come up with a synthesis that provides greater research power. And there's an important role for librarians in these kind of studies in that we search for those studies, we find them, we help organize the information, and as we become more skilled in the methodology, we're helping kind of shepherd these projects through. So when we were 2 years ago at the NF Summit in Chicago, I was learning a lot about NF research, and there was a lot of encouragement to become involved in that. And I was just thinking, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a nurse, I'm not a social worker, what can I do? And then I was just thinking, I do research. There are systematic reviews done on neurofibromatosis. It would be great to be a part of a research team that was doing one of these studies. And it took some time to find one, but I did get hooked up with a researcher at Florida State University who has done a lot of NF research, and she was embarking on systematic reviews, and I've been part of her research team on this project that will probably lead to multiple projects. And it's just been super satisfying to combine my life in the NF community with my professional life and expertise that I have in my work.
Absolutely. That's wonderful. I wanted to get a chance to get you to comment on, what about, I know you have a background in research, but what about these kinds of partnerships with researchers really draws you to the space?
Yeah, I think it's a nice way to just, as you said, there's so many different ways to get involved with NF community, and CTF is kind of facilitating a lot of those things. And so in my normal life, I'm working as a parent and advocating for Leo and going to doctor's appointments and doing things in our local community, but being involved with research allows me to kind of step back a little bit from that immediate context and go up a little bit further upstream and hopefully do things that will benefit more than just our immediate family and our local community. So that's really satisfying and just kind of, exercising a different muscle in terms of advocacy for NF.
Yeah, I think that's wonderful. Thank you, Michael. We have some time. I was wondering if the audience had any questions for either myself or Michael. If you have anything you want to say. No? Dr. Siegel?
Hi, thank you. This is so fascinating. As someone on the other side, it's great to hear, who really wants to hear the patient perspective, it's great to hear that there's a mechanism for this. So I would just love to hear what kind of projects could someone who has no background in research, what kind of projects could they be involved in, and how could they lend their voice to help the NF research community?
Sure. Yeah, we actually just had a whole meeting on this this last month, so it's top of mind. I think the important thing to think about with patient engagement research is you have people like Michael who have professional skills, who have an interest or a background in one thing, and that's really valuable, right? That we are bringing our expertise to something. The other thing that I think is important to think about is you as a patient have inherent value, and you as a parent have inherent value, and your experiences are expertise. You guys are experts, of course, in NF and in your own care, and that just you being in the room, just you talking to a researcher, you don't have to know anything about specifically the genetics or the science or the clinical care, although it does help, and that there's value in that. And we think, particularly with the FDA listening session, I think that shows that really well, that storytelling is just as powerful of a tool as being able to sit down with the researcher and look at data. So I think that we think about these particularly long-term relationships like Michael has with his researcher. You think about how much personability and storytelling that you do with a friend, or a coworker over a long time, and how important that is, I think, to the integrity of the research community. Thank you, Dr. Siegel.
I'll just add that part of my value is being a librarian and having that expertise in the group, but I think that Dr. Ho really also values me being part of the NF community and talking to me as a parent of someone who has NF. I think she's just thrilled to have someone on her research team who is part of this community and gets it.
Yeah, and I'll just note, last year we were in Arizona for both the NF Summit and the NF Conference, and there was kind of an ability to mix one day, but even on the conference side, talking to basic researchers, we don't think of patient engagement, patients having much value in basic research, but this researcher was telling me that he's been studying NF for 10, 15 years, and he'd never met a patient before. And even at the very most basic level, those relationships are really important to kind of cultivate. All right, any other questions? Oh yeah.
Hey guys. Testing? Oh, whoa, okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, not enough coffee in the morning yet. One question I had was, as a parent, we have a 4-month-old who has NF. How do you think about, sort of, I guess, is like we want to help and we want to do everything, and as parents, we're going to jump into it with all our energy and whatever time we can spare, and whatever sleep we have. How do you think about and how do you make decisions around, how to involve the kid in balancing, I mean, they're a patient, right? Like they're, having them be a part of these studies and maybe clinical trials and so forth with, well, they're a kid, they can't make decisions for themselves, and sort of keeping them on a normal life. Like, I guess maybe as a parent, how do you think about that piece of things?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, so one thing that comes to mind immediately is that the listening session that you showed the picture from a few years ago involves lots of NF patients, and I think that...
Kids,
yeah. So that's one way to get involved, and I think people in regulatory agencies and legislators probably respond to NF patients and from kids talking directly to them about their stories. That was our keynote this morning, was talking about one person's journey, and that's incredibly powerful, as we all saw. And I think another thing is just, as a couple of people mentioned, I feel like yesterday, just educating and involving your child as early as possible in age-appropriate ways, explaining their condition, explaining why you're going to the doctor, explain the science to them as they are able to understand it, just involving them and showing them how to advocate for themselves really kind of develops them into a person that can advocate for themselves in lots of different spheres, and this can be one of those.
Yeah, I think that's well said. I don't think there's much I can add in terms of research engagement, but as a family, you guys do these things together. You choose to participate in a clinical trial together. You might choose to get more involved in research together, and I think there's a lot of learning opportunities there for you and your child to talk about. Who are the people that are working on the cures and the treatments for NF? Do you know them? And how do they know your child? I think that's important relationship there as well. All right. I think those are all the questions. If you have any thoughts about CTF Engage and you want to know how to get more involved, come find me after. Thank you.